something that wasn't normal for people, which is eating apples months and months later than they're picked. Because this system would have assumed, right, having to bring apples from Canada over to London to move things around, right, the Commonwealth, which meant looking at, climate, storage issues, so on and so forth. So it's a very useful article in that regard. Another along the focus on commodities, this is Natalie Cook's article. Natalie is a literary critic and a food scholar, and her article, which I'm going to reduce to a minute, focuses on the controversial debates around the arrival of margarine in a serious way in the 1950s and 60s in Quebec and Ontario. And what Natalie does quite effectively is to kind of highlight the cast of characters in these very melodramatic debates that take place. So there's the farmer, the consumer, the policymaker, and also butter and margarine become kind of rival characters in this. So they kind of take a life of their own as well. So some examples of the debates: dairy farmers, cheesemakers try to scare consumers into sticking with butter, with alarmist claims that falling butter consumption would threaten the entire agricultural industry, related industries, and even the quality of soil. On the other hand, the margarine advocates were trying to woo customers by emphasizing the lower cost of margarine, and also trying to help its image, because margarine was seen as the poor man's substitute for butter. So, and it was a very bland, had a bland kind of non-color. And so among the things they did as marketing attempts to get people to purchase margarine was to introduce the yellow packet of coloring that you could squeeze into the margarine in order to make it a nice bright yellow that looked like butter. They also used a classic case of, this is a corporate spokesperson, an actress who's filling a fictive role, but presented in a kind of cozy way, and she's there to help you put the color into the margarine, and also kind of like there's the Aunt Jemima counterpart and others, but also creating this whole fictive world, right? There she is, answering letters and dealing with margarine recipes, all as a way of trying to bring people into the purchase of margarine. To shift, another article that kind of uses food in a way as sort of public spectacle is a piece by Molly Unger, who is looking at, this is a menu from one of the very elaborate banquets that was put on for the Royal Tour of 1939. And there are very elaborate ones in Montreal, in Victoria, and so forth. And what Molly does is to kind of highlight the fact that food becomes a sort of way of putting nationalism on the national table. Also, the British imperial enthusiasm of the period as well, and it's very elaborate meals. And there's always a French-English combination in them. So they'll talk about, the spring vegetables are of both British and French origin. There were elaborate ice sculptures of Canadian scenery with butter in it, and so on and so forth. So kind of food as public spectacle. Moving right along, another set of articles are dealing with the issue of regional food traditions. So, in a country like Canada, with the kind of geographic scale of Canada and the regional diversity, and also the different moments of encounter, that happen among different groups in different parts of the country, it's not surprising that regional food traditions also have a long history, an important history. In some cases, people feel that the regional traditions are more authentic in a way. They're trying to create a kind of national cuisine. So I don't have time to capture the wonderful nuance of these articles, but Marlene is on Newfoundland, on Newfoundland food traditions, and one of the things here I want to highlight is that, unlike the rest of North America, Newfoundland food practices were not so much rooted in agriculture as they were rooted in the fisheries. So the white settler adaptation of indigenous hunting and gathering, but also the fisheries are really important. And she talks about the persistence of this kind of identity, even well into industrialization, well into the failure of the cod fisheries, all of the struggle that's gone on, that this kind of identity around the fisheries remains really important. On the other part of the country, also looking at food Regional Foodways is Megan Davies' piece on early 20th century foodscapes in the Peace River region, in this case in British Columbia. And again, I can't spend much time except to say that the white settlers, when trying to build in New England, in BC, that their encounters with indigenous peoples, she suggests, led them to have a kind of more ecological approach to the land, some recognition of the land as a vital resource. Another set of articles deal with the theme of nutrition, right? The role of nutrition and the evolution of food taste is among the forces that shape food practices. And this one is a couple of ads from Cheryl Warsh's piece, which looks at the ways in which, from 1914 to the early 1950s, she's looking at the way in which food companies used advertising to sell what they claimed was power food that would give your child vim and vigor, and that the way they did it in some ways was to really play on the fears that parents have, the anxieties that parents have always about the health of their children, and the way in which they use that to sell these goods. So you get, the kind of more boy babies than the girls, and they talk about the need to get girl or to get vim foods in the mornings. And there's a variety of differences that occur across the period, but this kind of playing on parent anxieties is a kind of constant. Here we have Caroline Durand's paper, which deals with nutrition, in this case looking at Quebec school texts and teaching nutrition in Quebec Francophone schools, before the Quiet Revolution, home economics, domestic science schools, and so they're prescriptive texts, and she quite nicely looks at the kind of mix of things that are going on in these texts. So on the one hand, you get this kind of seemingly very scientific, rational approach to nutrition and to what happens when you eat food, right, in this almost kind of mechanical way. But at the same time, she also shows, these texts were often written by priests, by nuns, in a few cases by dietitians, and so they're also very steeped in ideology as well. So notions of French-Canadian nationalism, rural values, right, the woman in the home, surveillance stuff is very important. At the same time, this is also a message about the individualism of economic liberalism and so forth. So this kind of apparent contradiction of messages is what she dissects very effectively. Another of the nutrition articles is Ian Mosby's look at the origins of what became Canada's food guide, and Ian quite nicely is looking at kind of the social construction of healthy eating through the origins of the Canada food rules. The origins are in World War II, and a really important force is the fact that the wartime state, right, is very concerned about ensuring industrial productivity, about ensuring agricultural sustainability, about military fitness, all of those things, and it launches the very first kind of cohesive national public health campaign. And finally, Catherine Carstairs has a very nice piece on, an earlier mindful eating movement, the health movement of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and that's Adele Davis, who was one of the important leaders of the health food movement. But again, what Catherine does is a great example of when you look in the past, you see things that are familiar but also unfamiliar. So among the things she finds is that, the kind of baby boomer image that everybody was growing sprouts and making whole grain breads is not the total story on the health food movement. That in Canada, for example, it began earlier. Some of the post-World War II immigrants, Germans, others, were important actors in the movement in Canada. And she also points to the diversity of people who were involved, men and women are both involved, and also to some of the ironies and the problematic politics. So there is this kind of obsession with pep pills. There's a lot of talk about pep pills, but there's also an interesting and somewhat, disturbing eugenics thread running through some of it too. So some of them talked about, for example, that they wanted to create a super race of Canadians, which might be funny on one level, but on the other always has a kind of possible, right, more disturbing sense to it on the other side. So I'm going to pass it on to Marlene to talk more about women.
So this is the Italian and the Mennonite show tonight. thanks also to you from me for coming out tonight and to this, the organizers of this great conference. All three of us editors, as well as many of the authors in the book, brought to this project our background in doing women's history and also our feminist sensibilities, or our frameworks and our methods as feminist scholars. So inevitably, we have had to ask the question as we embarked on our own research projects, including this book, and as we've spoken at occasions like this one, we've been compelled to ask the question, what does food history have to do with women's history? Or, as we've also phrased it, what's so feminist about food history? Certainly many feminist women's historians of the past, and probably still today, have recoiled at the prospect of food history, since the linkages between women's roles in the kitchen and patriarchal oppression have been so strong. As in, let's not associate ourselves too closely with that domestic drudgery of the kitchen. So by talking about women in the kitchen, about talking about food, are we just, in effect, returning women to the kitchen when they have just managed to free themselves from that drudgery? Another reason that some women's historians have shied away from doing food history is that, at least within the academy where we do our work, it is sometimes treated as not a serious discipline, much in the same way as women's history was disparaged when it had first arrived in the academy. Is it kind of a return to high school economics, perhaps? Or it's just about ordinary life and thus kind of irrelevant? Or alternatively, is it too much fun for the academy? So that I just finished last night, actually, teaching a 12-week course in food culture and history at the University of Waterloo. And as one does in a food history course, I occasionally bring food to class, even though I actually don't like cooking, that's my confession. But I bring food to class, whether it's my mother's Mennonite Spivak, when we talk about ethnicity and food and migration and memory, or when I bring Canadian war cake that doesn't have butter, eggs, or sugar to talk about food rationing in World War II, or when this semester I found a box of Twinkies when they were in danger of disappearing from the shelves, and brought it to class and we talked about Twinkies. And my colleagues frequently say, well, no wonder that course is popular, you always bring food, in a slightly critical kind of way. What are we just doing, eating for 3 hours of the day? And in this particular course, the first week when we're doing our introductions around the classroom, there's one sort of a young man kind of easing back in his chair, and when it gets to his turn, he says, well, I'm a physics student, and my father makes sausage, so I figured this would be an easy course to take. I handed out the syllabi, then he didn't come back. Well, in a deliberate effort not to be nostalgic, only nostalgic about Mom's kitchen, much of the historical work on women in food has centered, and rightly so, on dysfunction and deviance. Whether the focus was on girls and eating disorders, rebellious daughters, narratives of hunger or starvation, or the marginalization of foreigners, smelly foods. And women's relationship with food and its attendant tasks has been depicted as one of oppression and drudgery, even while women are ironically praised for serving as the drudges. More recently, perhaps rising from interest in exploring women's agency and empowerment alongside their oppression, research on women and foodways has taken a much more positive spin, which is evident in many of the chapters of our book, in much of the research that others of you are doing here. Certainly, feminist research methods have been important to us and to food history, I think. Feminist scholars have asked questions about power and oppression, about essentialism and social construction, about victimization and agency, the personal and political frameworks of anti-racism and anti-colonialism, all of which figure prominently in our understanding of the history of food and foodways. Further, feminism's pioneering interest in such spheres of historical interest as daily lives and ordinary rituals in domestic space and activity and reproduction, and more recently in the body, suggests that the study of food too can be taken seriously in a field of scholarship by historians if a feminist gaze is applied. Well, we do need to acknowledge that historically food, of course, is gendered in so many ways, and particularly in a feminine way, as grocery shopping, food preparation, and cleanup are all coded as women's responsibility, despite, however, many men do perform those functions. And again, referring to my student who just last night did a presentation on food and TV advertising, they expressed with astonishment, you know, TV advertising about food really is gendered. And I felt, okay, I succeeded after 12 years. Sherry Innes, who's one of the leading American theorists on food and gender, bluntly says that if we are to study women's gender roles, we need to study food. And this comes through in so many ways in our book and in many of